All right, I'll just get going with some housekeeping and then we can get started while people still roll on. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight at the beginning of our events. I'd like to read the land acknowledgement that was created with the MIT Indigenous Peoples Advocacy Committee and also in partnership with ACES and the Native American Student Association and other Indigenous MIT students and alumni developed with the ICEO. So we like to just read it at the start of events. I know there's a part where it's like, how effective is this? Is this really doing something? Are you saying words without putting action behind it? But we also think it's important to acknowledge and to think about, I know we're all on Zoom, so we might be in different places, but also where we are and about our history. So MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of the territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. And I'll put in the chat the map where you can see maybe where you are if you're not on MIT campus or in Cambridge. So we do have closed captioning enabled for this event. So if you want to turn them on, you can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a live transcript and you can just hit that CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and that should come up. If anyone has any questions, you can message me about that. There will be a Q&A portion of this event. So you can either, don't use the chat button because that's harder to track. There's a Q&A button next to that live transcript button. So please go ahead and use that Q&A, add your question there. Folks can upvote if you're like, that's the question I was gonna ask. I really wanna hear the answer to that. Please go ahead and upvote that. If people want to use the chat, you can use that, but it might not get caught as a question. And then you also will be able to, if you prefer to unmute yourself during the Q&A portion to ask the question, that will be an option as well. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat just to follow WGS on social media if you're interested. And I'm gonna turn it over to Lerna for introductions.
Hi, and welcome to our fall 2021 McMillan Stewart Distinguished Lecture Series in what we used to call Women in the Developing World. We are in the process of changing this naming, the problematic and somehow old-fashioned and politically incorrect naming of the series. We are very happy. I'm Lerna Mitchell. I'm the McMillan Stewart Chair in based in History and Women and Gender Studies program, and I'm the person who has been organizing this series for the last decade or so. We are very happy to have and very lucky to have Anila Daulatzai today with us. I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and will not explain why we are having this event about this topic at this time because it's all too unfortunately very, very obvious. So after the introduction, I'll just pass it to Anila. She's going to read the paper for about 40-45 minutes, after which we'll have time for question and answer. Dr. Daulatzai is a sociocultural anthropologist and the Chancellor's Fellow at UC Berkeley. She has taught in prisons and in universities across 3 continents. She has been conducting research in Afghanistan as well as with Afghan refugees in Pakistan since 1995. Between 2006 and 2013, she carried out ethnographic fieldwork in Kabul and taught at Kabul University and at the American University of Afghanistan. Her past and current research projects look at widowhood, heroin use, and polio through the lens of serial war. She has published articles in Jadaliya, Al Jazeera, several academic journals, and is a contributing member to Brown University's Costs of War project since 2014. She is currently completing her book manuscript, provisionally titled War and What Remains: Everyday Life in Contemporary Kabul, Afghanistan. Thank you so much, Anila, for being here. And I really wish we were hosting you under very different circumstances. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lerna. I really appreciate the space that you created to discuss Afghanistan and your invitation a few months back. Of course, it's been stressful for all Afghans, of course, some differently for those in Afghanistan, but certainly stressful. And I hope to share some thoughts, and I look forward to the Q&A. If there are students out there, I just want to especially encourage students, don't hesitate to ask anything. Of course, I'll share my email in case those who don't feel comfortable asking and want to ask after, because I always get some people after that were shy or whatnot. So I'll make sure to put my email in the chat. What I'm going to do right now in the chat is I'm going to be putting a link to a book that I'm going to, it's a novel that I'm going to be citing. So I'm going to share that. Is it there? I think so, right? So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to be reading. It's about 45 minutes, right? So I'm going to try to keep to that, Lerna. If I'm going a little bit over, then please don't hesitate to just let me know. But I think I've timed it. So it's about 45 minutes, so we can save time for questions. So the title of the talk is Afghanistan's Serial War and the Cunning of Imperial Time. So as Lerna said in the introduction, I'm working on my book manuscript based on my research in Afghanistan, and what I'm going to be reading is two sections from two excerpts from the book. So they may seem disjointed, but one is from the intro, and then one is from just ethnographic research, right? So, and I'll let you know where that cut is, or hopefully it becomes apparent, right? Afghanistan, Serial War, and the Cunning of Imperial Time. So I'm starting with a quote from a book by Jamil Jan Kochai, an Afghan novelist who wrote a book in 2019, 99 Nights in Logad. And I put the book in the chat in case anyone's interested. So this is a quote from Kochai. So for the next few days, I did Dawood's homework. It was easier that way. We just randomly went over words: sad, khafa, anger, God, rifle, tupak, tank, tonk, war, jung. No, jung is like a fight. War is bigger. Dawood looked to Gul. What's the word for war? I don't know if there is one, he said. Zia, can you think of the Pakto word for war? Wood, like a fire? No, Dawood said. War, like. And Dawood took a stick and turned it into a club, into an axe, into a sword, into an AK. And he picked off targets on the road: the steer in the fields, and the kids in passageways, and the sleeping donkey, and the wasps in the mud, and the dust on the road, and the birds, and the leaves, and whatever else passed us by. And we were so impressed with his demonstration that we didn't think to stop him until he accidentally took a shot at someone Gul thought might have been a T, and Kochai uses T for Taliban. It is remarkable, so that's the end of the quote. It is remarkable that as the US has performed its ground war withdrawal from Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, or more accurately, the war on the people of Afghanistan, is spoken of with such for it. Jung is like a fight. War is bigger. What's the word for war? The struggle to find a words that would capture the range of affects or magnitude of death dealing in contemporary Afghanistan is not a linguistic deficiency of Pashto or Dari, but an inability for words in any language to capture the work of violence and war in the space of Afghanistan. In the fuller introduction to my book, I unpack two signature formulations: the forever war and the quote graveyard of empires, and reflect on disclosures from the Afghanistan papers that I argue are attempts at a turn toward innocence, inculpability, and even redemption for an illegal criminal war and occupation that came to also be known as the good war of the post 9/11 era, the war in which the war on terror found much of its sustenance politically and culturally. Now, I'm reading only a limited section here today on the quote, forever war. Meanwhile, disrupting it, perhaps to signal contempt for the way sensibilities were disciplined all along about the war on the people of Afghanistan and how Afghans were racialized all along. So the forever war. The war on the people of Afghanistan is referred to as the quote, forever war by pundits, as well as the general public. Yet the quote, forever in forever war refers exclusively to US NATO time in Afghanistan, starting the clock conveniently from 11 September 2001, when the US was invaded, and not 7 October 2001, when Afghans were violently invaded and attacked. 20 years, they say. America's longest war, they say. Imperial time has its own timekeepers. Rarely, if ever, do we see the quote, forever war denote Afghan experiences with war, Afghan experiences with empires, and Afghan accounting of time. If this account centered on Afghan experiences, 2001 is not where we begin. We would go back at least to the 1970s and even maybe before, given US and Soviet presence in Afghanistan since the 1950s, to the mass graves from the communist regime. Mass graves have a way of saying everything for those who are attuned to listen. Instead, what we hear are imperial accounts of war, imperial anxieties of security, and allow imperial time to tell us what time it is and how long it has been. Tick tock. Tick tock I'm using to represent imperial time here. Americans have been in war for 20 years and they didn't even know it, until now, that is, as they clumsily scrambled to end it. Afghans have been in war for 43 years and every Afghan knows it. Serial war for over 40 years. Tak, tak. And tak, tak is what I'm using here as the onomatopoeia to represent the sound a clock makes in Dari and Pashto. And I'm using it here to connote Afghan time. In April 1978, 20 months prior to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a military coup known as the Sword Revolution brought Soviet-backed Nur Muhammad Taraki to power. The Taraki regime disappeared 50,000 to 100,000 high school students, farmers, nomads, teachers, intellectuals, and others. Afghans were subject to imprisonment, routine torture, and rape. Puli Charki prison in Kabul was overcrowded with Afghans from every walk of life, the site of serial executions and mass graves. Afghan families are still haunted by the brutalities and violence of the Taraki regime. Until today, families are awaiting acknowledgement for the deaths of their family members. Tak, tak. The Soviet invasion and 10-year occupation followed from 1979 to 1989. Anthropologist Mahmoud Mamdani wrote on the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in 2002, and this is a quote from Mamdani. Perhaps no other society paid a higher price for the defeat of the Soviet Union than did Afghanistan. Out of a population of roughly 20 million, 1 million died, another 1.5 million were maimed, and another 5 million became refugees. UN agencies estimate that nearly 1.5 million have gone clinically insane as a consequence of decades of continuous war. Those who survived lived in the most mined country in the world, end quote. For the 5 million plus Afghans who became refugees, they faced discriminatory refugee regimes in Iran, Pakistan, Europe, the US, Australia, and elsewhere, which continue until today. Afghans, after Palestinians, are the longest standing refugee population in the world. Afghans remain at the top of every asylum seeker's roster. Tak, tak. Following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in the early 1990s, there was a mad scramble for power between several warring militias. Afghans killed Afghans with weapons and money from the US, Pakistan, the formerly constituted Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia, China, Israel, and elsewhere. Whoever was willing to trade in death came to their aid. Every one of the factions vying for power murdered and massacred Afghans, destroying the capital city, Kabul. Tak, tak. In 1995, the Taliban appeared, a product of the chaos of, at that time, 17 years of nonstop war, including a 10-year brutal foreign occupation. Human rights organizations extensively documented the violence of the Taliban regime against Afghans, particularly the restrictions on dress and work for women that made headlines throughout the world. Meanwhile, the targeted brutalities against minority Hazara Shiite communities got less coverage than the clothing restrictions placed on women. The Taliban and its opposition in the newly consolidated Northern Alliance continued active war and violence as civilian Afghans continued to be subject to the by now routine violence. Tak, tak. Charles Hirschkind and Saba Mahmood in 2002 offered a much needed commentary on what the specter of the Taliban at that time erased. And this is a quote from Hirschkind and Mahmood from 2002. The trope of Islamic extremism allowed a vast field of wrongs suffered by Afghan women to be consolidated within a simple and singular explanatory framework, with a fundamentalist Taliban at its center. Why were conditions of war, militarization, and starvation considered to be less injurious to women than the lack of education, employment, and most notably in the media campaign, Western dress styles? End quote. The US NATO invasion and 20-year occupation began with the 7 October 2001 invasion of Afghanistan. In 2021, after 20 additional years of war and foreign occupation, where Afghans were surveilled, humiliated as normative practice, subject to night raids, drone strikes, airstrikes, threats, and deaths by the latest version of Afghan militias trained and funded by the CIA, and made forever disposable by both the US NATO forces and the reconsolidating Taliban, resulting in the direct deaths of 170,000 Afghans. It is remarkable, although not surprising, that the question posed by Mahmood and Hirschkind almost 20 years ago, and I'm going to repeat the question, why were conditions of war, militarization, and starvation considered to be less injurious to women than the lack of education, employment, and most notably in the media campaign, Western dress styles? Now, particularly, and that's end of quote. Now, particularly considering that the entire country is on the verge of starvation, why has this question not lost any of its urgency? 4 decades of war and still counting. Serial war, serial occupations, serial killing would only begin to approach an Afghan accounting of time, while 2 decades as the invading occupying power gets the distinction of, quote, forever in imperial time. Yet this 20+ years discrepancy between an Afghan accounting of time and an imperial counting is not just bad arithmetic. The discrepancy is a deliberate miscalculation by US empire, with Pakistan as a more than willing partner to distance itself from the material and other support it provided, billions in money and in weapons to various groups under the broad umbrella of Mujahideen in the 1980s and thereafter. There is little question that the weapons and support were critical for the Mujahideen to robustly counter the sheer horror of the Soviet occupation. Yet those weapons and that financial support and investments had further trajectories, afterlives. They were so significant that they fundamentally altered the social political landscape. Those machinations need a social accounting. While many insurgencies receive financial and material support from elsewhere, an erasure of the global transfers and material support by registering them as routine is simultaneously dehistoricizing, revisionist, and deathly consequential, particularly for Black and brown bodies in the global South. Imperial time restarts the clock when needed. The cunning of imperial time feigns the precision of a finely tuned Swiss watch when declaring 20 years. Yet, as I show, imperial time telling fixes violence as local and organic to the geographical terrain of Afghanistan and inherent to the people. Imperial time obscures the global terrains of racialized militarization that decades earlier collectively conspired to designate Afghans as disposable. The 20 years that imperial time counts excludes empire's prologue. Tak, tak. Obscuring the global origins of terror not only enabled a, quote, global war against terror, but by unhinging the global from, quote, terror's origins, it became possible to provincialize it, localizing culpability for, quote, terror into discrete bombable sites and zones, as was the case for Afghanistan, the inaugural invasion of the, quote, global war on terror. The invasion was an event and yet is also an entire global architecture. Regardless of whether Afghans stay in Afghanistan, migrate to Pakistan or Greece by way of example, all harassment, violence, and even death are forever marked as justifiable. Violence racializes Afghans, and thus an Afghan accounting of time would certainly calculate for this permanent distinction. US empire has done the work to make it appear that by remaining in Afghanistan, the 20-year occupation was a gesture of care, humanitarian, quote, nation building at the expense of an increasingly frustrated, fed up population in the US. The classic white man's burden story is a resilient one. A racialized subject, the Afghan, is produced through the violence as well as through the self-exoneration from that imperial violence by seminal architects of the war. Ugly things happen in war, they say. We did our honorable best, they say. Now we must leave for Afghans to sort it out for themselves, they say. Khak the sarat, Afghans say. Tak, tak. And that phrase at the end, khak the sarat, it's the Dari equivalent for shame on you. It literally means like dirt on your head. So with the remaining time I have, I'm moving toward an ethnographic chapter, and this is a section, an excerpt from that. So with the remaining time I have today, I would like us to dwell on the life of one widow, Rahana. Rahana was 19 when I met her. She's now 32. As I sketch a solemn time in Rahana's life, I offer her experiences with war and humanitarianism and make 3 points. One, I focus on the care offered by the Afghan state. In doing so, I hope to unsettle ideas of care and what certain forms of care mean for an Afghan widow. Second, I offer Rahana's experiences with war to disturb limited ideas of agency in the face of a massive international war and occupation premised on the idea of liberating Afghan women that was ideologically invested in gender, which in a US-occupied Afghanistan meant women and girls only. I do this by offering pain and suffering as agentive. And third, while Karim and Rahana, their entire family, the 23 others, their loved ones, the suicide bomber and their loved ones were directly affected by this act of violence claimed by the Taliban, which I outline in this paper, in this excerpt, I hope to not contribute to the privileging of the violence of the Taliban while ignoring the stunning cruelty and violence of the last 20 years of US occupation and the 23 years of war that preceded this past 20 years. Thus, I situate the suicide bombing within the seriality of 43 years of war that I just now outlined, and ask what it means for Afghans when we reduce this history to only suffering induced by one perpetrator, the Taliban. My ethnography is based on almost 5 years of anthropological fieldwork in Kabul from 2006 to 2011, and for short periods in 2012 and 2013, and maps landscapes of care in Kabul. It engages the lives of widows and orphans as they mediate the uncertainties and contingencies that serial war and foreign occupation bring. Their quests for an adequate enough life, unremitting struggle of exhaustion, pain, humiliation, but also a patience, endurance, as they aspire to make lives that are livable despite profound uncertainty. My understanding of what it means to be a widow in contemporary Kabul comes through my friendships with the families who lost a loving husband and a friend in the June 2007 attack, and also from the many widows I came to befriend during my research. I first met Rahana 18 months after her husband Karim had left this world, which is the way Afghans express when someone has died. Karim had been a police officer and an instructor for new cadets in the Afghan National Police Academy. He died in a spectacular suicide bombing, which took the lives of 24 people, including 18 cadets, 4 police instructors, a bus driver, and a bystander in the center of Kabul on 17 June 2007. The explosion occurred at 8:10 a.m., Kabul rush hour, and was so powerful that it sheared off the bus's roof and sides and scattered shards of glass and metal for miles, injuring more than 50 additional bystanders. At the time, it was the deadliest attack on civilians and Afghan national security forces since the exit of the Taliban from Kabul in 2001. Due to the magnitude of the losses and because it took place in the heart of the capital city, the suicide bombing immediately made both national and international headlines. In a public announcement, the spokesperson for the Taliban claimed responsibility for the suicide attack. In Taliban parlance, a martyrdom operation, and boasted about the movement's reach, its quote, very, very successful operation, end quote, and its ability to gain access to the police center in the capital city. Then Afghan President Hamid Karzai, without delay, referred to the victims of the attack as martyrs, announced that the Afghan state was organizing and would pay for the funeral for each killed police cadet and instructor. In addition, Karzai also announced that a special fund would be created to provide for the families of the martyrs as they'd been killed while in the line of duty and while serving and defending their fellow Afghans, end quote, rebuilding their country, making it more secure, end quote. Now, despite the disarray and grief, within minutes, the mothers, wives, and grown children of the killed police instructors and cadets were calling each other, making sure that all knew about Karzai's public announcement of his intention to care for these families. The wives and mothers encouraged each other to go to the Ministry of Interior to claim their right as families of the martyrs. The fact that the president was publicly announcing a special fund created specifically to care for the families of the young cadets and their instructors was unusual. As in the case of hundreds of Afghan police, army, or intelligence personnel who had been killed before this explosion, there were no special provisions to provide the families of those killed with the care that would help them navigate the world without their brothers, fathers, and husbands. At the time of the bombing, I'd been in Kabul for 9 months conducting ethnographic research with widows and their families, as well as teaching at 2 universities. 18 months later, in December 2008, Jabbar, a student of mine who was aware of my long-standing research with widows, asked me if I would be willing to volunteer my expertise and assist the Ministry of Interior in determining how to best support the families of the martyrs of the June 2007 suicide bombing. I was hesitant, as until then, I had done everything possible to not be associated with any NGO, state, and or army. I volunteered my services in any way I could be useful to the widows and their families, knowing that I would explicitly reiterate that I was not working nor getting paid by the Afghan state, nor any NGO or donor agency, and was only there to advocate for the widows and their families. It was a necessary position to take in a space inundated as it was with the workings of the military humanitarian industrial complex. Jabbar was working for a German NGO that was partnering with the Afghan Ministry of Interior on one of the special programs designated to support the widows of this particular suicide bombing. I met with Jabbar and the Ministry of Interior administrator in charge of the program, as I wanted to get a sense of the most and the least that the German NGO and the Afghan state were able to do for these families before I went to meet with them. The administrator of the Ministry of Interior very bluntly instructed me to conduct a survey. I advised him that a survey was perhaps rather inappropriate to gain the information that was ultimately sought after. My insistence on an ethnographic approach, relying on open-ended interviews and conversation and participant observation, was not rooted in the loyalty to the methodological superiority of anthropology. It had to do with my sensibilities for the families of the martyrs and the expected inappropriateness of a survey in that particular context. In Kabul, every aid organization used surveys for everything, and far too often they were used performatively to make it appear as if the program that followed was based on the actual needs of Afghans. Afghans perceived surveys as an instrument of surveillance to ascertain if they were lying or exaggerating their need for assistance. The administrator eventually agreed that I did not have to use a survey and added that no matter what methods I used, he needed specific information on what kind of jobs the widows wanted and were willing to begin immediately. The survey he had devised contained a list of the jobs the widows could choose from: baking bread, making jam, gardening, cleaning, janitorial work at universities, and if they had the skills, embroidery. Have them choose which one they want to do, added the Ministry of Interior administrator. Women who were widowed in the June 2007 suicide attack were finally going to be given some form of assistance that had been promised by Karzai himself by presidential decree 18 months earlier. And the form of care was work. Now, in addition to offering a brief ethnographic account of widowhood here, my work in general focuses on how the lives of Afghans in Kabul unfold in a space constituted by various registers of violence and within and across several distinct ideological, governmental, and moral regimes. In a span of 43 years, the country went through a spectrum ranging from Soviet-style socialist reforms, followed by religious orthodoxy of the Taliban, then the projects of war and humanitarianism during the US-led occupation characterized by liberalism, capitalism, and securitization, to now, with the second iteration of the Taliban. None of these various moralizing and ideological projects ended, however, when the respective phase of war was over, but lingered on and continued to have a hold over the lives of Afghans. Given the multiplicity of the projects underway in Afghanistan, the ethnography that follows focuses at the points where these projects intersect in the lives of Afghans and aims to explore the conditions under which Afghans negotiate these projects and the associated competing logics and practices. My ethnography maps landscapes of care in Kabul, where logics and practices of neoliberalism and neoliberal forms of governance frequently work parallel with other forms of care, including Islamic ethical obligations to widows and orphans. In these landscapes of care conditioned by serial war and humanitarianism, certain modes of being a widow are produced more frequently and privileged while foreclosing possibilities for others. As neoliberal logics and practices are part of a landscape of care in Kabul, I briefly circumscribe the understanding of neoliberalism I'm working with here as related to the lives of widows I came to know. Now, cultural geographer David Harvey and Paul Traynor consider neoliberal governance as related specifically to employability, and this is a quote. Neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Harvey goes on to cite Paul Traynor, quote, neoliberalism is not simply an economic structure. It is a philosophy. This is most visible in attitudes to society, the individual, and employment. The idea of employability is characteristically neoliberal. It means that neoliberals see it as a moral duty of human beings to arrange their lives to maximize their advantage on the labor market. It is an ethic in itself, capable of acting as a guide to all human action and substituting for all previously held ethical beliefs, end quote. Particularly over the last 10 years, anthropologists have used the discipline's distinctive methodologies and concerns to bruise detailed and sophisticated ethnographies of neoliberalism and late liberalism. I draw on this literature to explore how the logics and practices of neoliberalism work alongside other forms of care within the space of war, but also serial war and humanitarianism. So temporally, when I speak of serial wars, I attend to the durational aspect, 43 years of wars and humanitarianism in the lives of Afghans. Affectively, I refer to this history as producing sensibilities and aspirations that resonate with logics, such as neoliberalism, and that have an unexpected kinship with affects of exhaustion and resentment at being rendered dependent, serially, aspirations to be self-sufficient, no longer under occupation, not part of the schemes of others. The What Remains part of my ongoing book project titled War and What Remains, Everyday Life in Contemporary Kabul, Afghanistan. So I now return to Rahana and her family. I was given a list of the names of the martyrs and their quote addresses, which were not quite addresses with house numbers and street names, as street names and house numbers are not common in Afghanistan. More precisely, it was a list of the districts in Kabul where the houses were located and the descriptions to aid in finding each house. For example, next to the bakery with a green door, facing the cemetery, and next to the kite shop. Find shopkeeper Abdullah at the corner general store and he will escort you to the front door. Anytime I had to ask a shopkeeper or child in the neighborhood for directions, I used the martyr's name, and I was always taken straight to the house I was looking for. Everyone in the neighborhood knew where the widows and orphans of this particular suicide attack lived, and in general, and any districts in Kabul. Most everyone knew the houses where widows and orphans resided. After I had located Rahana's residence, I walked into the courtyard and was met by her father-in-law, the father of the police cadet Karim. I introduced himself by telling him I was here to speak to the widow of Karim, to see how she was and to learn about her life since she lost her husband. Karim's father led me inside the house, where I first met his wife, Karim's mother. I sat down on the floor cushions with her. A young child of about 5 years was sitting with us. The boy was Karim's nephew, Sikandar. As I was speaking to the mother, the father was summoning Rahana. Sikandar, the martyr's nephew, got up and returned a few seconds later with a framed photo of Karim in his police uniform. Karim's mother held the picture to her chest and began wailing. Then Sikandar started crying. Rahana, a shy woman of 19 years, entered the room, wiping her eyes and nose with her chador. It looked as if she'd been crying. Rahana had married Karim when she was 17 and was pregnant with her first child when Karim was killed. The baby was sleeping in the other room. And as she sat with her mother-in-law and me, her father-in-law asked if he could sit with us. For more than 3 hours, they cried, while narrating to me the kind of person Karim had been, the jokes he used to tell, and his dream to return to Uruzgan to farm almonds like his grandfather had. The family hails from Uruzgan province in the south of Afghanistan. They came to Kabul in 2006 to escape the intense fighting in their province. Kabul to non-Afghans is war zone. Kabul to Afghans outside of Kabul is a space of hope, possibility, relative security. Karim's father narrated how his younger brother had been killed in 2005 by Australian soldiers who insisted his brother was Taliban. We sold everything to come here to save ourselves from this violence. They shared with me the life of Karim, repeatedly stating that it was the will of Allah that Karim is no longer in this world. And although they knew it was the work of Allah and accepted it, they could not reconcile how to make a life without seeing him every day. They told me that they had not gotten through one single day since the attack without sitting and crying together as they were with me. I eventually got to asking Rahana how she could be helped. She asked me what I meant. I told her that I was asked to see what kind of help the widows of the police cadets needed. She asked me to keep her and her child and family in my duas, prayers. I then asked what else. The family stated they were utterly exhausted trying to get any compensation to them over the past 18 months. So they were surprised that the state was now interested in helping Rahana. What help do they want to give me? She asked. Work. They asked what work you want to do. Rahana looked at me and repeated, work? That is how they want to help? I don't want to work. I want to care for my son and be with my family. This pain and this struggle to get through the day, this is enough work. I cannot do more work than this. I eventually met with 21 of the 22 families over a period of 1 month. Each of the families exposed the neglect they felt from the Afghan state and detailed how they had to fight to gain any of the compensations promised by the special presidential decree Karzai had issued, declaring that the families of the martyrs would be taken care of. At that time, it was already 18 months after the suicide attack, yet all the families were still deeply embroiled in bureaucratic procedures. Over the course of that month, as I moved from house to house, the women who were widowed in this attack and their families expressed their dismay that the only offer of assistance from the state was for the widows to be offered work. Over the next 2.5 years, from 2008 to 2011, I kept in frequent contact with many of the families. During my visits, families continued to recount the day of the suicide blast, always sharing pictures of their son or father or husband, and continued to recite how painful it was for them to have to relive that horrific day over and over as they became ensnarled in the bureaucratic processes required to obtain the official declaration of Shaheed or martyr status, and to pursue the financial and land compensations they were entitled to. I went to the Afghan ministerial and land distribution offices with them as well as without them in order to understand how the Afghan state was responding, specifically to the presidential decree to care for the survivors of the martyrs. After visiting all but 4 of the families on the list, I went to the Ministry of Interior and tried to convince them to consider another form of assistance for the women who were widowed in this blast. They made it clear to me that they could not change the terms of the assistance. The Ministry of Interior administrators explained to me that the reason it took so long in the first place, 18 months after the blast, to get any kind of help was they were waiting for some funding line for a program that could help the women who were widowed. The German NGO funding the initiative through the Ministry of Interior was beginning a gender empowerment program. The Ministry of Interior saw this as an opportunity to include the women who were widowed in the attack in this initiative by prioritizing them for this program, empowering women by getting them to work. Now, in the context of the international war and occupation, it was the agenda of donors that ultimately delineated the logic and practices of the Afghan state for very specific criteria that enabled or disabled funding mechanisms. In fact, it was not unusual at all that the program to support the widows was primarily a gender empowerment program. With the billions of dollars that poured into Afghanistan for reconstruction efforts from 2002 to 2020, 141.24 billion to be exact, just from the United States, at least 787 million was spent on programs specifically targeting gender, which in itself would not preclude the inclusion of males and other genders, but in a post-Taliban Kabul, these were programs targeting women and girls only. The total amount of US investments to improve the lives of women and girls, according to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, is actually, and this is a quote, not quantifiable, because hundreds of other programs, meaning in addition to the 787 million, and projects included an unquantifiable gender component, end quote. So in essence, the act of war by the US-led coalition, justified as saving the women of Afghanistan from the tyranny of the Taliban, was presented as an act of care for the women of Afghanistan. According to the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction, and again, this is a quote, Afghanistan is the only country in the world where this level of resources has been exclusively and explicitly dedicated to elevating the status of women and girls, end quote. The widows of the June 2007 suicide attack became targets of humanitarian assistance schemes as women, but not as widows. This means that these schemes focused on their gender exclusively, thereby ironically excluding the particularly gender trajectories of suffering and loss these women experienced. Both the Ministry of Interior officer as well as the student Jabbar, who had approached me to meet with the women widowed from the suicide attack, were exasperated that the widows refused work. In separate meetings, they both began by saying that we Afghans have become lazy. The Ministry of Interior officer, why do they not want to work? Do they want to be dependent on charity their whole lives? Jabbar, who do they think they are? They want to be cared for and dependent on others? This is the problem of Afghanistan. Everybody just wants charity. The questions were rhetorical, but I nevertheless gave a defense to the position of the widows and their right in Islam as ones who have haqq, right or entitlement, and that thus was not to be understood as charity. His reply was, it's not about their haqq. It is about their program that the Ministry of Interior and the German government is creating for them, and they need to work. They need to work to build this country, and it's their duty not to be dependent and lazy. There is no other option for them. I asked about the request from the widows who wanted jobs for their sons or other male family members. Their replies were clear. No, this is part of a gender program, and so it is only for women, for the widows themselves to work, not their sons or whomever they want. Besides, their sons should be working anyway, end quote. Jabbar's answer was particularly unexpected as his mother was a widow. He continued to defend his position when I asked him, so when your father left this world, and if you had been only 3 or 4 and this could logically not work, would you have wanted your mother to work? His reply was simple, Shukr alhamdulillah, thanks be to Allah. When my father left this world, I was not 4, I was 8. And I managed everything so that my mother never had to work outside of the house a day in her life. Both Jabbar and the Ministry of Interior officer summoned the rather historically inaccurate cliche often used by Afghans of Afghanistan being independent and unconquerable. We are Afghans, we are not beggars. It is not the Afghan way to be dependent on others. While the cliche of Afghans as fiercely independent is undoubtedly remnant of racist colonial typologies, the aspiration for Afghanistan to be free and independent is not racist colonial remnant. It is deeply rooted in the lived experiences of serial war, occupation, and displacement that figures prominently in the biographies of Afghans. Alongside neoliberal logics and practices of care and empowerment is zakat. Zakat is the alms given by Muslims as a percentage of their income as an act of worship. The money gets redistributed to others facing hardships. In Islam, widows fall under the rightful deserving recipients of zakat. In addition to zakat, Muslims are encouraged to offer sadaqah, or voluntary care, to widows and orphans in every way possible. Many Islamic states, such as Pakistan, collect zakat from its Muslim citizens and redistribute it to those entitled to receive zakat. In Afghanistan, except for a short period between 1880 and 1901, zakat was never regulated by the state. During Taliban rule, attempts to systematically collect zakat were made in certain areas of Afghanistan. Yet after the departure of the Taliban from Kabul in 2001, President Karzai issued a decree specifying that zakat was a personal matter and that Afghans needed to manage themselves and their moral obligations to the deserving. All this to say that zakat and sadaqah are forms of care Afghans know and are familiar with as both providers and recipients, and thus both form an integral part of the landscape of care in Kabul. In addition to zakat and sadaqah, there are spontaneous forms of care rooted in embodied obligations of kinship, or khairat, doing good deeds. As part of my fieldwork that I undertook before I met the widows of this particular suicide attack, I sat with women on the streets of Kabul as they asked passing cars for alms. The women would utter Zane Bewa, which is widow in Dari. Most to all of the people in the cars would give something as soon as the words Zane Bewa were uttered. I often found myself chasing cars and asking the giver why they'd given money. Most of the answers went something like this. We are Afghans. We know what it means to lose in war. Sometimes smaller things like property, our ability to work in our own country, the ground beneath our feet. But to be a widow means you lost more than the ground, more than a job. And the widows on this street remind me of that every day. I came to learn from the women I sat in the street with that more than a few of them were not even widows, yet they presented themselves as such. As I came to understand widowhood in Kabul, it is a form of social currency. By uttering Zane Bewa, you were more likely to get support. Women who were not widows were presenting themselves to others as widows. The performative force of Zane Bewa, widow, stems from the reality of over 43 years of war. Every Afghan family I met had widows in their houses. In some families, every single woman from age 16 to 67 was widowed, some serially, meaning having remarried only to be widowed, to be remarried again, to be widowed again. Afghans across political, class, religious spectrums take the care of widows sincerely. So one of my tasks as an anthropologist in contemporary Kabul is to try to make some sense of this. What is the work in the lives of widows? And how do neoliberal aid agendas aim to restructure logics and practices in ways that are incommensurable with other moral economies, such as the ethics of care for widows and orphans, rooted in Islamic ethical practice and broader kinship obligations? Political theorist Wendy Brown has written on neoliberalism and its undoings, and this is a quote from Brown. What happens to rule by and for the people when neoliberal reason configures both soul and city as contemporary firms rather than as polities, end quote. How do neoliberal agendas, while incommensurable in some ways, resonate in other ways with the deep resentment among Afghans about being made perpetually dependent on the agendas of others? And finally, the elephant in the room. Since one goal of feminism is to work towards self-determination of women everywhere, when widows are given jobs, that is, when wage labor is the only form of formal care they're being offered from the Afghan state as mandated by the international donors, then how do we read Rahana and other widows' refusal to work as an agentive nevertheless? While there certainly were widows who did not object overtly, as Rahana did, to the suggestion of outside employment, where do we locate the agency of women, the empowerment of women, if it is not they, but others who think they need to be working to have agency, to be empowered? And here I quote from Sabah Mahmood. What do we mean when we as feminists say that gender equality is a central principle of our analysis in politics? How does my enmeshment within the thick texture of my informants' lives affect my openness to this question? Are we willing to countenance the sometimes violent task of remaking sensibilities, life rules, and attachments so that women of the kind I work with may be taught to value the principle of, quote, freedom? And furthermore, does a commitment to the ideal of equality in our own lives endow us with the capacity to know that this ideal captures what is or should be fulfilling for everyone else? If it does not, as is surely the case, then I think we need to rethink with far more humility than we are accustomed to what feminist politics really means, end quote. What potential harms ensue when Afghans and widows in particular are being sold the neoliberal dream, the pull yourself up from your bootstraps, be self-sufficient. You are responsible for your success or failure narrative in a space and place contemporarily and historically wrought with wars that come from elsewhere. As I outline the contours of care in the context of Syrian war, instead of working women in Afghanistan as a primary way to gauge the success of the US war and occupation, I would like to shift towards a focus on the ordinary ethics of women like Rehana, who were widowed in this particular suicide attack and elsewhere, to articulate the quiet, everyday ways Afghans pursued their ethical aspirations of endurance in the face of often utterly exhausted circumstances. Many of the best intentioned may want to believe that the best thing to come out of the US war and occupation, itself premised upon the promise of, quote, liberating Afghan women, is for Afghan women to be working and part of the labor force. I would, in far more brevity than what is demanded, like to situate such well-intentioned sentiment with historical reminder, to give a full picture of the constellation of experiences that constitute everyday life for Afghans. Afghans, very much like Karim's family I introduced here, lost loved ones throughout each chapter of the more than 43 years of war and occupation. My work encourages alternate ways of understanding empowerment and our agency, so they must not only be recognized in limited formations that may fit our imaginations for Afghan families or Afghan women in particular. Afghans have learned to endure uncertainty, pain, suffering, and humiliation repeatedly, serially. I'm quite certain that not enough work has been done to understand what Afghans have had to collectively and individually experience and endure. How have Afghans learned to sanely inhabit a world that they have come to know as ultimately a painful one? And what are the quiet ways all Afghans have navigated loss, pain, and learned both sane and less sane modes of living lives adequate enough for this world? Surely such navigations have and do require agency and active willed endurance in the pursuit of a livable life. I use the work of Talal Asad as offering one alternate way of understanding a form of agency that may be more appropriate for Rehana and perhaps others in Afghanistan. Asad speaks of pain and suffering as agentive and encourages ways of exploring the ways that different traditions allow a subject to inhabit a world that is ultimately painful. And this is a quote from Asad. When we say of someone that they are suffering, we commonly suppose that they are not agents. To suffer physical or mental pain, humiliation, deprivation is, so we usually think, to be in a passive state, an object, not a subject. We readily allow that pain may be a cause for action, of movement to end suffering, say, but we do not normally think of it as action itself. Yet one can think of pain not merely as a passive state, although it can be just that, but as itself agentive, end quote. For widows in Kabul, pain is an active submission to the experiences of suffering that have come to constitute everyday life in Kabul. Women in Kabul navigate forms of pain through the contingencies and vulnerabilities that stem from historical and contemporizing moralizing governance, both via war and the care of humanitarianism. This is another quote from Asad. What a subject experiences as painful and how are not only culturally and physically mediated, they are themselves modes of living painful relations. The ability to live such relationships over time transforms pain from a passive experience into an active one, and thus defines one of the ways of living sanely in the world. It does not follow, of course, that one cannot or should not seek to reform the social relations one inhabits, and still less that pain is, quote, a valuable thing. My point is that one can live sanely or insanely in a painful world, and that the progressivist model of agency diverts attention away from our trying to understand how this is done in different traditions, end quote. I shift away from limited ideas of agency rooted in liberal moral economies and reinvest attention into how it is that ordinary women who have been widowed have come to navigate sanely in a world that has demonstrated to them as not only a painful and always humbling one, and at times a humiliating one as well. As I come to the end of my talk, I offer two cautionary notes. The first, I'm not saying that development and international aid was done all wrong in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, and if only it took into a quote Afghan quote culture, everything would be fine. This is not the point I make here. My concern is much rather not only looking at how Afghan lives have been disrupted by serial war, but also what forms of life are disabled by humanitarianism. The war in Afghanistan was presented as an act of care. I hope my work can unsettle liberal imaginations of what it may mean to care. As in the case of Afghanistan, it is such liberal ideas of care that enable the possibility for war on a people to be justified as an act of care. Furthermore, as I've tried to demonstrate, neoliberal moral economies privileging the individual as self-sufficient are eclipsing moral economies such as zakat and sadaqah and khairat, rooted in notions of the self, as constituted through social relations. That is a self that is not simply limited to an individual, but a self suspended in forms of relatedness and obligations within a collective or a community. My second cautionary note, and there is literature that states that in times of war and conflict, as state institutions disintegrate, people fall back on kinship as primary forms of support and care. But this is not what I'm arguing here. And I would never want to imply that in pre-war Afghanistan, zakat and dependence on kinship and community networks were stable and ideal forms of care and support. There is robust critical kinship studies literature that demonstrates, as well as my own research and my own kin relations, that kinship is just as much constitutive of betrayal as it is of loyalty. What I argue here is that while serial wars, occupations, and humanitarianism have complicated obligations of care, I'm aware that kinship itself is complicated and is not simply nurturing and supportive. In speaking of Islamic ethical practices of care for widows and of kinship obligations towards widows, I'm not positing these practices and obligations as culturally or religiously more suitable alternatives or solutions, as these practices can be both nurturing and predatory. Yet, like humanitarian forms of care, constitute part of the landscapes of care that widows have to navigate in contemporary Kabul. Rehana's case is illustrative of the international community's obsession with metrics of working women and her girls going to school. Now a new metric replaces these ones. The once upon a time seemingly fulfilled women and girls of Kabul and their families, and literally all Afghans are now at risk of starvation amidst complete economic collapse, with only 10% of the 30 million population in Afghanistan meeting their daily nutritional needs. Yet the nature of the injury in Afghanistan for much of the world is again read as an Islamic fundamentalist one, the Taliban, who curtail the freedom of the women and girls of urban centers, and not serial war, nor foreign occupation, and certainly not the global machinations that conspired and created the conditions of possibility that produced, cultivated, and eventually all but choreographed the dramatic return of the Taliban to Kabul in August 2021. If pain and suffering is agentive, if humanitarianism undercuts the possibility of zakat and sadaqah with the cautions I've just mentioned, how is it possible to see what the promise of the future might be? Drawing on Dipesh Chakrabarty's work, that many people are now consigned to the quote, imaginary waiting room of history, end quote. I echo anthropologist Beth Pavanelli, that people are still, quote, living within these waiting rooms, whether we want them to or not, and are on the edge of life, located somewhere between given and new social positions and roles, and between the conditions of the past and present and promise of the future, end quote. To repeat myself, so what is the promise of the future? The neoliberal ethic of being responsible for yourself, getting a job to be self-sufficient suggests that that is the promise of the future. Pavanelli and other social scientists have demonstrated the problematics of neoliberalism and capitalist modes of normativity that make one believe that one is working on a dream, to quote Bruce Springsteen. Many around the world know that this dream of work ethic, self-sufficiency is dubious. and the US is no exception here. But what about the particular problematic posed by a neoliberal ethic of being responsible for yourself, getting a job to be self-sufficient, when at no time in the past 43 years have Afghans been in charge of their own destinies and instead have been rendered killable? They are and have been subject to the geopolitical and other machinations of others. How do projects of self-sufficiency and hope, heaped onto other layers of hope, work for people who have been historically and contemporarily deceived? Yet saying Afghans have always been subject to the games of others does not mean Afghans are not also doing something else. And this is why I believe Dalal Asad's work on agency and pain is useful to partly explain what Afghans are doing. And this is why I dwell on the sentiments of the Ministry of Interior officers and Jabad, and of many other Afghans I came to know, of the aspirations for Afghans to be independent, because after all, as they argue, they are Afghan. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Anila. This was really fascinating. There's a lot to discuss and think together and digest.
Mm-hmm.
So we are open now for questions. You can either raise your hand or post your questions on the Q&A part of Zoom. In the meantime, I am going to ask my questions, I guess, to initiate the conversation. Mm-hmm. Yes, so not being from anthropology and not being very theoretically oriented myself, I have to say, I understood what you were talking about, which is already a very good thing, I think, for me, at least. And I really appreciate these two things that the way that I see it. On the one hand, you have this framework of imperial time versus Afghan time, and they are different. And on the other hand, you're discussing I don't know how to put, but maybe like indigenous ways of approaching responsibility in the case of widowhood versus what you call neoliberal slash, I don't know, maybe pseudo-feminist or co-opted way of feminist understanding, colonial feminist understanding of empowerment and gender egalitarianism that's not so needed. So how do these two things connect? Meaning, like, is there a parallelism or analogy between the two times and the two ways of treating widows, or understanding what are, what they are, and what our responsibilities are towards them?
Yeah, no, I like that question, Lerna. I can't give a specific answer to, like, is there a connection? What I was trying to do with the Afghan time and imperial time is to recalibrate our sensibilities, particularly in this time, you know, over the past few months since August, right? It's just very reminiscent. You know, I was in Afghanistan to the days before the events of September 11th, right? I was there until September 8th, 2001. And I remember, I mean, this sense of, okay, so now the world is going to understand what's happened to this people in this place, right? Yet I was just so stunned by the, you know, even in academic circles and other, right? And that's why I took the care that I did to sort of detail, right? I'd never thought I would need to be like a sort of recounting the violence of war, but in a scene where that's not really understood. Right. So even like speaking to gender specialists, right. And I saved this field work toward the end of my research in Afghanistan, my last few months there, because I just really knew it was going to be actually maybe as difficult as working with widows and their families, right, is to understand just the stunning ignorance about this place. So they're gender specialists who were gender specialists either newly, meaning they just newly minted and were going between Iraq and Afghanistan, or had been for decades, didn't really understand the contemporary history of Afghanistan. The way they came to understand Afghanistan was through the lens of the Taliban. So the suffering of women was really, really limited, and that was the grounds upon which they made all these programs and gender programs, right? And you have to also keep in mind, and I'm going to say this to everyone, even though it might be obvious to many that have been to Afghanistan or other places, for example, like Iraq, because it was done similarly, if you are a gender specialist in Afghanistan working for the UN or USAID programs, you really don't go to Afghan family homes, right? The only Afghan woman or widows that you engage with are the woman that serves you tea 3 times a day. And the language skills are just not there to be able to communicate more than hello and thank you, right? So you're making million, I talked about 787 million at least programs on gender made by, quote, gender specialists that didn't even understand the extent of what Afghan women had gone through. And they weren't able to go through, and they rationalized that I wasn't able to go to Afghan families because I would really love to be able to do what you do, Anila, but I just can't because of these security protocols, right? You can't go. You weren't even allowed to go in restaurants where Afghans would eat. There was only special restaurants that Afghans weren't allowed and where foreigners were able to go, right? So all this to say, right, is for me in doing that imperial time and Afghan time was to really give a sense that we're really talking about two fundamentally different ways of understanding what is contemporary Afghanistan and how it came to be what it is, right? And so for me, like I said, I never thought I would have to take that time just like situate it and say, let's pause and think about what's happened, but that's unfortunately the case. And oftentimes when I'm invited, not only in the last few months, but over the several years, for people who invited me to give talks on my research, I was always grateful, of course, but I was always asked, can you please focus on what are some of the things that widows are doing to get on their feet and how resilient they are. And I was always very forthright, and I said, well, yeah, after I detail what's happened to Afghanistan, I'll get to those good feeling stories that you want to hear about the resilience of the widows. Because again, and I write about this in my work, resilience is also a language of neoliberalism, right? That no matter what happens to you, no matter what you suffer, you're going to get back up on your feet. You're going to still produce. You're going to still be the empowered woman, empowered widow, whatever, right? And so for me, it was trying to write against that. So in terms of your question of how does it go along the different ways of the zakat and other forms of care, I haven't thought of it, but they certainly parallel each other, right? I don't want to make a binary, and that's what I try to trouble in the talk, saying this is what I'm trying not to do, is just make it binary and saying there's a traditional way and a colonial way. That's definitely not what I want to do, but I do want to sort of trouble the ways people have come to understand Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you. I know what you mean. And I think in some of your publications, it is in one of your articles, I remember you discussing the lack of anthropologists, for instance, who would provide knowledge of the place at the time of the American invasion, and they would be going back to like studies that have been done in the 1980s to base these gender policies, which I might ask about it later, but we have a few questions here. Professor Michael Fisher, who is an anthropology professor here at MIT, I think I'm going to start from the beginning. I was struck that you wanted to invoke Jamil Jan Kuchai's novel at the beginning. And I wonder how you think about the writing possibilities of the novel or of a film like Baran about the experience of Afghans in Iran and those of ethnography. I ask mainly because we seem to be stuck in a double narrative. Neoliberalism versus lived life. But it seems that women and other living beings have richer ways of inhabiting the world. Suffering as agency seems impoverished or maybe abstract. And obviously, I mean, as I'm reading this, you'll answer, and you know, probably, I haven't read the novel, but I read, as the rest of humanity, probably The Kite Runner, as the novel about Afghanistan that brought Afghanistan home, brought like the terrible Taliban home type of, so if you can incorporate that one also. And also he commented that imperial time and Afghan time is powerful, but we need much more on Afghan time. And that the very idea that the war in Afghanistan was a war of care is not plausible. That's not what George Bush could possibly have thought. These are the comments. Maybe this last one is separate.
Okay.
And provocative.
Say again?
And provocative, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate your questions and comments and yeah, and your take on this. Now, you were struck that I wanted to invoke Jamil Jan Koshai's novel. Yeah, in terms of ethnography and novel and film, like a film like Baran, I see is a little bit, yeah, I use Kochai's novel very clearly because he engages with war, and he does it in important ways. He spent a lot of time in the south of Afghanistan and was able to reflect and write in very important ways. And unfortunately, and I have to say this as a critique of anthropologists whose work, who have worked in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. He, as well as a long-form journalist, Anand Gopal, I think have captured a lot more about Afghanistan than anthropologists have, right? And so I engage with Jamil Jan Kochai's novel, right? Because I think it has far more sensibilities that align with the people of that I have met in Afghanistan and what I have seen in Afghanistan. We're stuck in a double narrative, neoliberalism versus lived life. I'm not sure if you want to elaborate on that more. Michael, if you're there.
Hi.
Hi. Hello.
Here. Thank you so much for the talk. It's really, really eloquently done.
Thanks so much for coming, Michael. I really appreciate it.
So I agree with what you just said about novels.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to incorporate more and more of what shall we call good ethnographic novels, formulate that, and in or next to the ethnography that I try to write as well, because it is a form of, novelists do very much what anthropologists do in a sense. They do field work, they listen to people, and then they try to represent it in a way that will move audiences, let's put it that way. And they often, so I guess what I'm saying, I guess I've been on a little bit of a hobby horse, and forgive me for this, but I'm still writing some manuscripts on this.
Good for you.
A little hobby horse of trying to get anthropologists to not genuflect so much before political theorists and very high abstract theory. As you might know, I think of myself as a theorist, as a social theorist, but I also blame a lot of ethnographic writing these days as invoking empty theory. theory that's supposed to do work that it doesn't really do.
Mhm.
And so I really, that was the point of my saying, so I like the idea of imperial time, and I like the idea of
Mhm.
insisting on serial wars
Mhm.
as opposed to singular wars.
Mhm.
You know, the forever war actually, you know, originally was formulated, I think, about Vietnam,
Mhm.
not so much Afghanistan. There are a lot of these serial wars that particularly have been fomented since World War II.
Right,
And
right.
we try to sort of separate them out,
Mhm.
and impose other kinds of categories. So I think all of that is really powerful.
Mhm.
But I think one of the things that is so hard to do, but that, you know, I think anthropologists try to do, is to provide an alternative account to
Mhm.
the abstractions that the young 20-year-olds who go to Washington and write policy papers, and, you know, instructions for generals and so on, do to do what you are doing with your ethnographic work, which is to really powerfully bring lived lives to the fore, and out of those lived lives to reconstruct theoretical formulations. So I'm struck by, and forgive me, and I'll stop the rant, but I'm struck by the genealogy of the anthropologists whom you cite, almost none of whom have worked in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
And they operate, you know, on a theoretical level.
Mhm.
And I'm not, and so I guess what I'm asking for is a kind of medium level theory that is really grounded in the experience on the ground, and can, you know, can interrogate the high theory if you like,
Yeah.
but is not the same thing. There seems to be a gap between the two.
You know, I like that, Michael. Yeah.
And just to tie it together with the last comment, I
Mhm.
mean, I don't think that the soldiers in Afghanistan were thinking about care. There's a really wonderful book about one of the lieutenants who went to Vietnam early on and tried to institute a program of care, participation with the Afghans that he was trying to defend, and how basically he got run out by the military system. It's just very hard to do if you're fighting a war. And while we made some gestures at it, we did some good, maybe, but that's not what war is about.
Mhm.
And that's not, you know, in a sense, in Afghan terms, what George Bush was after was revenge. Right?
Mhm. Yeah.
That was a kind of Jang, if you like. It wasn't, he had no strategic war objectives. You know, Kissinger might have, but
Mhm.
um, so there's a mismatch again in these levels of theory, if you like.
Mhm.
I don't know. That's a very big question. I don't really expect.
No, I appreciate it, Michael. I'm going to answer just a little bit of that, and I hope you don't mind if I follow up with you after, because I really appreciate your care and sincere listening to what I offered. I really appreciate that. I would agree with the high theory, and just really trying, and that's, you know, like for me, I'm stuck because I want to do different things with my work in Afghanistan, but then I also know that it's just, people just don't get it. Like I said, academics are alike, anthropologists of Afghanistan alike. And that sounds really arrogant of me to say that and to put myself and my work differently, but I've been largely disappointed by the work of anthropologists that have come out, and then and that's what leans me towards other thinkers and theorists. What you say here about suffering, I really like that, Michael, and I hope, again, once you don't mind, that I continue, because for me, I fundamentally, when you say it's impoverished, yes, and that's why I say in the paper, this is something Afghans are doing, right? Because I want the acknowledgement to be made of what Afghans have had to endure, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm putting them in the suffering slot, but that is something I'm fundamentally uncomfortable with, because, as I said, I don't like the quick turn. As I stated in Lerna's question, right? I don't like the quick turn to want to talk about the resilience of Afghan women and widows, right? How resilient they are without understanding what they've had to endure, right? So it makes then me kind of like in this suffering trap, so to speak, is how do I get the magnitude of what Afghans, women, and like everyone has had to endure differently, and how do I convey that in ways that capture it, and that, you know, unfortunately it slots them in the suffering slot, but at the same time I hope it does a different kind of work. So as I said, I really appreciate that you pointed that out and that you sense that, because it is something I'm not comfortable with, but I'm really trying to think how one does that. And again, I hope you would be up to us continuing our conversation, you know, like over a Zoom chat or something, because I really appreciate your sincere engagement, Michael. I hope that's sufficient for now.
We
I'd,
have
I'd, I'd, I'd love to do that, just to say, I'd love to stay in touch. Afghanistan, as you may or may not know, I spent a fair amount of time there,
Absolutely, no.
and I love the place, and I'm so sad about all that has happened. And I'd love to stay in touch and watch you develop the voice of what you very clearly are trying to articulate.
I would
really
really
value that.
appreciate it. Thank you so much, Michael. I have so much respect for you and your work and your sincere commitment to Afghans. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Michael.
Okay, so two other questions.
Mhm.
One from Nora Lesserson.
Mhm.
This is a question about how to, or can we bridge these two times or sensibilities? What produces the stunning ignorance, particularly in a think tank world? And how do we disseminate effective knowledge, or can we?
Ah, wow. That's a great question, Laura. Laura, I'm wondering, Nora, I hate to do this, but to put it like to ask you also, right, and others, right? Like how can one do that, right? Because I don't, yeah, what produces the stunning ignorance? Like like I said, I'm somehow stunned by it, you know, even for those who then come work in Afghanistan in various capacity, as I said, anthropologists included. I don't, yeah. There's sensibilities and ways of coming into any space. And I know that me, you know, being born and raised in Los Angeles brought its own sensibilities and problems as well, right? But ultimately, you know, if anybody has thoughts on this, right? Nora, what are you thinking there?
I'm sort of
Thanks so much for the question.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad it made sense. I was wondering if I should even ask
Absolutely.
anything.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking a lot about this question sort of from a 19th century perspective. I'm writing a history of an Ottoman Armenian man who came to the United States and really thought that knowledge would create change. If people knew more about these people,
Yeah.
who they had preconceived ideas about or their own ideas about, that would produce change. And the two interesting questions are there, that A, he believed that, and B, that of course no one changed their mind. And so whenever I see this still happening in the 21st century, I sort of wonder about especially all of us who sort of have dedicated our lives to producing knowledge with the hopes presumably of changing minds. What do we do? How can we do?
Yeah, that's is really a great great way of putting it. But then, you know, also really, I'm not going to say sad, but it's just, you know, because for me, I realized quite a long time ago that like knowledge wasn't the, like, if they only knew better, then they would do better, right? Yeah, I mean, you know, whether it's climate deniers or COVID deniers or, you know, and I'm just using contemporary examples, but like for me, what I have seen, and I hope not to give like a sort of very skeptical take on knowledge, but like there's not a direct link to knowing and doing. And I think in scholarship, we've, as you rightly and so nicely put, we often have fallen into that trap that, you know, that this, you know, like, and again, I feel that I've fallen into this trap again. And that's why I appreciate Michael and others. You know, is is that I just need to use the space to let people know what it was, right? But then, you know, with me, I have these very acute sensibilities and commitments to the families and Afghans all over the world, right? That say that, you know, if it's not about a knowledge and giving a knowledge to others that don't know, it's about just some loyalty and semblance to a people and a place, right? And yeah, and then that becomes more important than it, you know, like I mean, yeah, like I said, if I mean, Edward Said put it just very simple, you know, if it's not as if though if we just read Edward Said's text on Orientalism, then like everything would change and we'd be like, oh my God, oh yeah, we can't do that. And oh, we can't, you know, think of people from certain parts of the ways of the world is that way, and right, then everything would just change, right? It just, it's yeah, there's yeah, it's, I wish I had an answer, Nora, right? And like I said, that's why I just opened it up only to say, like, I feel that question. I feel it well. I wish I thought that by me doing the work that I do in Afghanistan, that would mean that policy is better. I know it won't be better. Unfortunately, there will be good people in their everyday capacities as bureaucrats within the Afghan state, which I saw in my fieldwork very clearly, that were doing everything they could within the means they had. There will be, you know, everyday ordinary people that do, but in terms of like larger like policies, yeah, I'm not. So yeah, I don't know, I don't mean to be so grim, but I don't know if that's helpful, Laura. Thanks.
That's very helpful. It just helps me feel not crazy and sort of, yes, heard, as you said.
I'm totally with you. We work in different spaces and places, and yeah, but definitely I have that same conundrum in different ways. And yeah, like I said, I don't mean to be so skeptical about knowledge, but one has to be.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming.
Okay, the last question, asking, I could have said, okay, someone is saying that they could have sat for many hours listening to your book.
Kind.
The question is, what does an anti-imperial feminism look like? What kind of demands can it make of the state?
That's a fabulous question. What does an anti-feminism,
Anti-imperial
feminism? I like the anti-feminism in the ways that it's been played out. What does an anti-imperial feminism look like? And what demands can it make of the state? So this anonymous attendee, if you're still there, again, I just like to engage with those asking questions just so I can say, like, why are you invested in making demands of a state? Are you there? Yeah, because I really like that question. And again, like the person, anonymous attendee. Okay. Yeah, so for me, my first, and I would want to hear from them. Hopefully they pop up. If they don't, I would just want to know why they're wanting to make demands of a state, right? Because for me, an anti-imperialism, imperial feminism would also try to undo the state. In terms of it's very ideas of borders and boundaries and the ways, yeah. So for me, you know, I would want to have an anti-imperial feminism that sort of works in different ways across national boundaries and borders, looking and unsettling and, you know, like, as I tried to do in this paper, liberal ideas of just what it means to live and be alive, right? And to recenter other ways of being in this world, right? It would certainly include, you know, engagements with, you know, the living landscape. so to say, right? So the environment and the climate, right? So for me, I would think broadly in those terms of ways. And I would, for me, anti-imperial feminism also, doesn't make demands of the state. It makes demands of one another in ways that tries to, because the state to me has been, and I've shown hopefully in the example of Afghanistan has enacted, care in different ways, and it's been quite violent, right? So violence and care and how they go together, right? Thanks so much for that question. And if you're there or not.
Thank you so much, Anila. This was a very interesting and important conversation. It is recorded. It will be uploaded to our WGS site very soon for many others to enjoy. Unless there is any other questions, I'm going to end the meeting here.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Lerna, and thank you everyone who stayed for this long and for coming. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Sophia.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye-bye.
All right. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a good night.